My husband left me drowning in $50,000 of forged debt while he drove off with his new girlfriend. I was completely blindsided by his ultimate betrayal, but I refused to simply surrender without a fight. I thought my life was over until my 12-year-old son looked at the scattered bank statements, pulled out his laptop, and said calmly that he had already taken care of it. 5 days later, my phone rang with a panicked call that changed everything. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back when the person you trusted most tried to destroy you. The heavy thud of the thick manila folder hitting the kitchen island still echoes in my ears. I am Maya, and at 35 years old, I watched my husband of 13 years pack his bags. Jamal stood in the foyer of the beautiful home we had built together, pulling the zipper closed on his designer duffel bag. He did not look guilty or ashamed. He looked like a man who had just finished a tedious errand and was eager to get on with his weekend. I stared at the papers spilling out of the folder he had just thrown at me. It was a formal notice from our bank congratulating us on a $50,000 home equity line of credit. The problem was that I had never applied for a line of credit. I picked up the thick paper, my hands trembling uncontrollably as my eyes scanned the bottom of the signature page. There was my name executed in black ink, but the looping letters were completely wrong. The angle of the lettering was too sharp, and the spacing was entirely off. He had forged my signature. "What is this, Jamal?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, as the devastating reality of the document sank in. He did not even bother to look up from adjusting his luxury watch. A ridiculously expensive watch I had bought him for his last birthday using my own bonus money. "It is exactly what it looks like, Maya," he said smoothly. "I needed capital for my new venture. Since you were so unwilling to support my vision, I took the initiative. You will figure it out. You always do." A sharp, obnoxious honk pierced the quiet suburban air from the driveway outside. I stepped toward the front window and looked out. Sitting in my driveway was a brand-new, pristine white Mercedes-Benz. Behind the wheel was Jasmine. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and tapping her manicured nails impatiently against the leather steering wheel. I knew exactly who she was. She was the 24-year-old marketing intern he had hired 6 months earlier at his struggling tech startup, a company that had yet to generate a single dollar of sustainable profit. Now she was laying on the horn of a luxury vehicle that was undoubtedly paid for with the stolen equity of my home. "You stole from us," I said, my voice rising as the initial shock gave way to a burning absolute rage. "You forged my signature and took out a massive loan against the house we bought for our son." Jamal grabbed the sturdy leather handles of his duffel bag and sighed deeply, as if my legitimate anger was just another minor inconvenience in his busy day. "Do not be so dramatic, Maya," he said, walking casually toward the open front door. "The house has plenty of equity. Consider it your final investment in my potential. I will have my lawyer send you the divorce papers by the end of the week. Try not to make this messy for our son." He walked out the door, leaving it wide open behind him. I stood frozen in the kitchen, listening to the heavy thud of his bag hitting the trunk of the Mercedes. The engine revved loudly, and the tires crunched aggressively against the driveway gravel as they drove away, leaving me standing in the wreckage of a 13-year marriage and $50,000 in fraudulent debt. Panic set in immediately. I lunged for my phone and dialed the bank, my fingers slipping against the glass screen. I had to freeze the accounts before he could drain anything else. As the automated system asked me to enter my account number, I paced the length of the kitchen, breathing heavily. My mind raced through the past decade of my life. I am the director of supply chain logistics at a major retail corporation. For years, I had been the sole provider for our family. I had passed up 2 major promotions that would have required relocation, all because Jamal insisted his latest business venture needed stability in this specific city. I funded his failed tech startup, his disastrous attempt at a logistics consulting firm, and his short-lived real estate flipping business. I paid the mortgage, I bought the groceries, and I put money into his business accounts every time he claimed he was just one investment away from a massive breakthrough. The customer service representative finally answered. Her polite corporate tone felt completely disconnected from the absolute disaster unfolding in my kitchen. After verifying my identity, I demanded she freeze all joint accounts immediately. I need to report a fraudulent loan, I told her, gripping the edge of the granite kitchen counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. A $50,000 home equity line of credit was opened using a forged signature. Brenda placed me on a brief hold. When she returned, her voice carried a distinct note of pity that made my stomach drop instantly. Madam, the funds from the home equity line were dispersed 3 days ago, she explained very gently. Furthermore, looking at your joint checking and savings accounts, it appears significant withdrawals have been occurring over the past 8 months. The accounts are nearly entirely depleted. 8 months. He had been planning this exit for almost a year, bleeding our finances dry, while coming home every night and eating dinner at this very kitchen island. He had smiled at me, kissed my cheek, and told me he loved me while systematically dismantling our financial security to fund his new life with a woman 11 years younger than me. I hung up the phone and let it clatter onto the countertop. The silence in the house was deafening. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, trying to stop the tears from falling. I could not fall apart right now. I had to protect my house. I had to protect my son. Mom. I turned around quickly, wiping my face. My 12-year-old son Malik was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He was still wearing his school uniform, his heavy backpack slung over one shoulder. Malik had always been a remarkably quiet, observant boy. While other kids his age were playing video games or watching videos, Malik spent his time disassembling old computers and writing complex code. He had inherited his father's ambition, but thankfully he had inherited my work ethic and strong sense of responsibility. I forced a smile, trying desperately to shield him from the devastation that had just occurred. "Hey baby," I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to sound normal. "How was school today?" Malik did not answer right away. He walked slowly into the kitchen and looked at the thick manila folder sitting on the island. He looked at the bank statements I had printed out earlier that week, which were now scattered across the counter. He looked at the empty space in the driveway through the window where his father's car usually parked. The afternoon sun cast long, dark shadows across the hardwood floor, highlighting the terrible emptiness that Jamal had just left behind in our home. I braced myself for the difficult questions. I prepared myself to explain that his father was gone and that things were going to be very challenging for a while. I even practiced the gentle tone I would use to promise him that everything would eventually be all right, despite the financial ruin hanging over our heads. Instead, Malik calmly took his backpack off and unzipped the main compartment. He pulled out his laptop, a refurbished model I had bought him for his birthday, setting it squarely on top of the forged loan documents. He opened the screen and his fingers flew across the keyboard for a few seconds before he looked up at me. His brown eyes were completely clear, devoid of the panic or confusion I expected to see in a child whose family had just been torn apart by betrayal. He did not shed a single tear or ask where his father went. "It is okay, Mom," he said, his voice chillingly calm and steady. "I took care of it." I stared at my 12-year-old son, completely taken aback by the unwavering confidence in his voice. I knelt down to his eye level, placing my hands gently on his shoulders. I told him he was a brave boy and a good son, but that this was grown-up business. I truly believed he was just trying to comfort me, offering the kind of innocent, helpless support a child gives when they see their mother losing everything. He did not cry, and he did not ask where his father had gone. He just held his refurbished laptop tightly against his chest. I pulled him into a desperate hug, fighting back the heavy tears that threatened to spill over my eyelashes. I promised him that I would fix this terrible situation, that nobody was going to take our home away from us, and that we would be perfectly fine, just the two of us. I sent him upstairs to finish his middle school homework, watching his small frame disappear around the corner of the wooden staircase. The moment he was out of sight, my brave facade completely crumbled, and the crushing weight of the $50,000 fraudulent debt settled heavily on my chest like a physical stone. The next 4 days blurred together in an agonizing, sleep-deprived marathon of pure survival. I was forced to take emergency personal leave from my position as Director of Supply Chain Logistics. I traded my structured corporate boardroom for a series of sterile, fluorescent-lit lawyer offices and intimidating bank branches. My entire existence shrank down to a singular desperate mission to prove that the signature on that home equity line of credit was a complete forgery. I sat across a massive mahogany desk from a stern-faced real estate attorney who explained the grueling, unforgiving reality of financial fraud investigations. He told me that major banks do not simply forgive $50,000 overnight just because a spouse claims they were wronged. I would need to file official police reports, submit professional handwriting samples, and potentially endure a lengthy, expensive legal battle to prevent foreclosure on the house I had worked so tirelessly to build for my son. I barely slept for 96 hours. I lived on strong black coffee and raw adrenaline, spending my long, quiet nights scouring our financial records and trying to untangle the massive mess Jamal had left behind. Every single document I reviewed was a new stinging slap in the face. I found the hidden transfers, the small, steady amounts he had been bleeding from our joint savings accounts for months to secretly finance his new life with Jasmine. The physical toll of the betrayal was exhausting, but the emotional betrayal was a completely different kind of agony that words can barely capture. I had sacrificed my own career progression, turned down highly lucrative relocations, and poured my hard-earned salary into his endless string of failed businesses. And his ultimate gratitude was to blindly mortgage my son's future and leave me holding the bag while he drove away in a luxury vehicle. By Thursday afternoon, my nerves were completely frayed to the breaking point. I was sitting on a tall stool at the kitchen island, staring blankly at a thick stack of fraud affidavit forms that needed my signature when my cell phone vibrated violently against the cold granite countertop. The caller identification displayed the name Brenda. It was my mother-in-law. For a brief, incredibly foolish second, a wave of relief washed over me. I assumed Jamal had finally told his parents what he had done, and that Brenda was calling to offer her profound maternal apologies. I thought she would be absolutely horrified that her son had abandoned his loyal wife and child, stolen $50,000, and driven off with a 24-year-old marketing intern. I took a deep breath, cleared the exhaustion from my throat, and answered the call. I prepared myself to receive her sympathy and grace. I was terribly, painfully wrong. Brenda did not offer a single word of comfort. She did not ask how her young grandson Malik was coping with his father's sudden and cruel disappearance. Instead, her voice came through the receiver, dripping with cold, calculating disapproval. She told me she had spoken to Jamal earlier that morning, and that she was incredibly disappointed in how I was handling the situation. I sat there in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the sheer audacity of her opening statement. Brenda continued her harsh lecture, her tone sharp and intensely patronizing. She told me that Jamal felt deeply neglected and suffocated in our marriage. She had the absolute nerve to claim that my demanding career in supply chain management had driven her son directly into another woman's embrace. According to her twisted, enabling logic, I was far too focused on climbing the corporate ladder and not focused enough on nurturing my husband's entrepreneurial spirit. She said a man like Jamal needed a traditional wife who made him feel powerful and respected, not a manager who constantly monitored his business failures and emasculated him with her own steady success. I was so paralyzed by her blatant gaslighting that I could not even formulate a coherent response. She was actively blaming me for his infidelity and his felony forgery. But Brenda was not finished tearing me down. She smoothly pivoted to the $50,000 debt, discussing it as if it were a minor household inconvenience that I was blowing entirely out of proportion. She told me that Jamal was starting a brand new chapter with Jasmine, and that it was completely unfair of me to saddle him with serious legal threats and fraud investigations just as he was trying to get his new tech venture off the ground. Then she made a demand that made my blood run absolutely cold. Brenda suggested that I take immediate responsibility for the financial strain I had supposedly caused the marriage. She told me I needed to protect Jamal's good name in our community because a public fraud investigation would ruin his reputation and jeopardize his standing with local business investors. Her specific solution was for me to sell my late father's vintage 1969 Mustang. The car was my most prized possession on this earth. A beautiful classic vehicle my father had spent 10 years lovingly restoring by hand before he passed away from cancer. He had left it to me, and Jamal knew exactly how much irreplaceable sentimental value it held. Brenda casually insisted that selling the classic car would easily cover the $50,000 and then some. She told me to pay off the home equity loan myself, drop the legal inquiries immediately, and let Jamal move on with a clean slate. She actually had the gall to use the phrase "be a bigger person." She wanted me to pawn off the last remaining piece of my dead father legacy to silently finance her son's luxury lifestyle with his young mistress. The sheer breathtaking entitlement of her demand snapped me entirely out of my shocked silence. The exhaustion that had been weighing me down vanished instantly, replaced by a white-hot, unyielding fury that radiated through my entire body. I gripped the phone tightly and lowered my voice into a dangerously calm register. I told Brenda that she had raised a coward, a thief, and a fraud. I told her that I would rather watch this house burn to the ground than sell my father's beautiful car to pay for her son's pathetic midlife crisis. I informed her that I was proceeding with the police reports and the federal fraud investigation, and that if Jamal wanted to protect his precious reputation, he should not have committed a serious felony against his own family. Brenda gasped loudly, her voice shrill with sudden indignation, as she called me a bitter, scorned woman who was trying to destroy a good man purely out of spite. She promised me that the family would stand firmly by Jamal, and that I would deeply regret trying to ruin his life. I did not give her the satisfaction of hearing another single word. I ended the call abruptly, tossed the phone onto the island, and let out a long, shaky breath. The battle lines were officially drawn. I was not just fighting Jamal anymore. I was fighting an entire family of enablers who viewed my financial ruin as a perfectly acceptable price for their golden child happiness. The house felt suffocatingly quiet after that toxic conversation ended. I spent the rest of Thursday, all of Friday, and most of Saturday morning gathering every piece of financial documentation I could possibly find. I printed out the internet protocol logs the bank had finally provided, hoping they would show exactly where the fraudulent loan was originated. I organized the paperwork into neat, meticulous binders, applying the same relentless logistics expertise to my divorce preparation that I used to manage global supply chains. I was preparing for a brutal, drawn-out war of attrition. I fully expected Jamal to ignore me for months while his expensive lawyers tried to bleed me dry in court. But the universe had a very different, much faster timeline in mind. On Saturday afternoon, exactly 5 days after Jamal had walked out that front door and driven off in the white Mercedes, my cell phone rang again. I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring hard at the thick binders of evidence I had compiled. The screen lit up, displaying a picture of Jamal from last summer. My heart immediately started pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I assumed he was calling to threaten me about the active fraud investigation, or to echo his mother's ridiculous demands about selling my father's car to save his skin. I took a moment to steel my nerves before answering. I promised myself I would remain completely emotionless, strictly professional, and absolutely refuse to let him hear any fear or weakness in my voice. I pressed the answer button and raised the phone slowly to my ear, waiting for his arrogant, dismissive tone. I was ready for his smug superiority. I was ready for him to tell me again to figure it out like he had on Monday. But the voice that came through the speaker was completely unrecognizable. Jamal was not smug, he was not laughing at me, he was screaming. It was a raw, guttural sound of absolute, unadulterated panic. The background noise sounded like a busy city street, and I could hear cars rushing past as he gasped loudly for air, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic, terrifying rush. I was begging, shouting my name over and over, demanding to know what was happening to him and his money, and the pure, desperate terror in his voice sent a sudden icy chill straight down my spine. "Maya, what did you do to my accounts?" Jamal screamed so loudly that the audio distorted through my phone speaker. I held the device an inch away from my ear, completely bewildered by the sheer volume of his panic. He was breathing heavily, sounding like a man who had just sprinted several blocks. "The accounts I use at our bank are restricted, Maya. My platinum cards are declining and several transfers have been blocked for review. I just tried to pay for Jasmine and her friends at a restaurant, and the waiter humiliated me in front of everyone. Tell me right now what you reported to the bank." I stood motionless in my kitchen, staring at the thick binders of evidence I had spent the last 4 days meticulously assembling. My mind, which was trained to process complex global supply chain logistics, immediately began to analyze the impossible timeline he was describing. I had not even filed the official police report yet. My lawyer had clearly instructed me to wait until Monday morning so we could complete the formal bank fraud complaint and determine whether any evidence needed to be referred to federal investigators. Banks do not spontaneously freeze corporate startup accounts or trigger forensic audits over a weekend without a formal legal mandate or a highly sophisticated internal security breach. I did not do anything, Jamal, I replied, my voice dropping into the calm, authoritative tone I used when dealing with hostile vendors. I have been sitting in this house organizing the financial wreckage you left behind. If your accounts are frozen, it is because your own reckless actions finally caught up with you. Do not lie to me, he barked, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate edge. I know you did this. My primary investors just told me their compliance team opened an emergency review after suspicious transaction records surfaced. The board has suspended any new funding until they verify the books. Jasmine is standing right here crying because her new credit card just declined at a boutique and the sales associate threatened to call the police for suspected fraud. Fix this, Maya. Call the bank and tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you authorized the home equity loan so they will unfreeze my assets. The sheer audacity of his demand was breathtaking. He had abandoned his wife and child, stolen $50,000, and driven off with a woman 11 years my junior. Now he was standing on a sidewalk somewhere publicly humiliated and broke, demanding that I commit a federal crime by lying to the bank to save his pathetic facade. I felt a cold, powerful smile spread across my face. I realized in that exact moment that the power dynamic had completely fundamentally shifted. I was no longer the arrogant man checking his luxury watch in my foyer. He was a cornered, terrified fraud. I am not fixing anything, Jamal, I told him, relishing the absolute finality of my words. You forged my signature to steal from your own son. You made your choices, and now you are experiencing the logistics of consequence. Do not ever call this number again. I pressed the red button to end the call before he could utter another single word of his pathetic begging. I dropped the phone onto the kitchen island and stood in the deafening silence of my home. My mind was racing a mile a minute. If I had not triggered the forensic audit and the bank had not yet processed my unfiled fraud claim, who on earth had completely dismantled Jamal and his financial network in a matter of 5 days? Then a sudden chilling memory pierced through the confusion. I remembered Monday afternoon. I remembered the scattered bank statements, the sun casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, and my 12-year-old son standing in the kitchen. I remembered Malik pulling out his refurbished laptop, typing furiously for a few seconds, and looking at me with absolute clear-eyed certainty. It is okay, Mom. I took care of it. At the time, I had completely dismissed it as the sweet, naive comfort of a child trying to protect his grieving mother. But Malik was not a regular child. He was a quiet, highly observant coding prodigy who spent his weekends building custom software and identifying security flaws in complex networks. I turned away from this kitchen island and walked quickly toward the staircase. My heart pounded against my ribs with a strange mixture of maternal concern and profound awe. I gripped the wooden banister and climbed the stairs, my mind replaying every detail of the past few days. Malik had been unusually quiet, staying in his room and only coming down for meals. I had assumed he was silently processing the trauma of his father leaving. I had no idea he was orchestrating a massive digital retaliation. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the hallway toward his bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently. The room was a stark contrast of typical middle school adolescence and high-level technology. Basketball posters and scattered sneakers shared the space with a large desk supporting 2 high-definition monitors, a mechanical keyboard, and a tangled web of Ethernet cables. Malik was sitting in his ergonomic chair, wearing his noise-canceling headphones, completely absorbed in the glowing lines of code cascading down his left screen. He looked so small, so young, yet the atmosphere in the room felt incredibly intense. I stepped inside and gently touched his shoulder. Malik pulled his headphones down, resting them around his neck, and spun his chair around to face me. His expression was completely neutral. "Hey, Mom," he said quietly. "Are you okay?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing pulse. "Malik, I just got a very disturbing phone call from your father. He is in a complete panic." He said several of his accounts had been restricted and that his startup investors had opened an emergency compliance review into suspicious transfers. "He thinks I did it." I paused, looking deeply into my sun-brown eyes. "Did you do something, Malik? Please be completely honest with me." Malik did not flinch. He did not look guilty or ashamed. He simply reached out and placed his hand on the computer mouse. "Dad was always really arrogant, Mom," he said, his voice steady and remarkably mature. "He thought because he bought expensive suits and talked loudly that he was the smartest guy in every room. But he was actually incredibly careless with his digital security. He thought he could just steal from us and walk away without leaving a massive digital footprint." I pulled up a chair and sat down next to him, my eyes fixed on the dual monitors. "What exactly did you do, baby?" I asked, keeping my tone gentle but urgent. "I need to know everything so I can protect us." Malik clicked a few buttons, closing the terminal window and opening a heavily encrypted file directory. "I did not break into anything, Mom," Malik said. "I did not guess a password bypass security or force my way into one of Dad's accounts. Do you remember the tablet he gave me last year when he upgraded to a newer model? He never removed his cloud account before handing it over. A large portion of his files had already synchronized locally onto the device while it was still his." My breath caught. Malik opened a folder on the tablet. I recognized the home equity documents immediately. "When Dad left on Monday, I saw the papers downstairs and remembered seeing the same bank name on the old tablet," Malik explained. "I checked only the files that were already stored on the device. The loan application was there along with the submission receipt, account notifications, and location history that had been synchronized before Dad gave me the tablet." He opened a copy of the loan record. "The timestamps did not match where you were when the authorization happened, Mom. The records showed Dad's account submitting the loan while you were away at your conference. I organized copies of what was already there and matched the dates against the travel records you had saved in the family calendar." I stared at him. "What did you send to the bank, Malik?" "I did not pretend to be you," he said immediately. "The fraud paperwork downstairs had a public case intake address and the reference number from the report you already made. I submitted a tip under my own name, explaining that I was your son, and that Dad's old tablet contained records connected to the disputed loan. I attached copies and told them they should verify everything themselves." He paused. "The bank's fraud team reviewed the information and placed temporary restrictions on accounts at their institution that were connected to the suspicious transfers. They did the investigation, Mom. I just showed them where to look." I sat there completely speechless, staring at the metadata logs, neatly organized on the screen. My 12-year-old son had accomplished in 48 hours what would have taken a team of highly paid corporate lawyers months to prove. But Malik was not finished. He turned his body to face the monitors fully, his face illuminated by the bright glow of the screens. "That was just the beginning, Mom. Once I saw the forgery, I reviewed the other business files that had already synchronized onto Dad's old tablet. I wanted to understand where the money had been going." He clicked another folder and a series of complex financial spreadsheets filled the right monitor. They were dual ledgers. One set of books showed a failing, struggling tech startup with minimal cash flow. The other set of books, the hidden ones, painted a much darker, more sinister picture of massive wealth transfer. "Dad did not just steal $50,000 from our house," Malik said, his voice dropping into a serious, quiet tone. "He has been running a massive embezzlement scheme for the past 8 months. He routed the stolen funds through a series of shell companies to mask the final destination." Malik highlighted a specific column of outgoing wire transfers. "I also found the public compliance contact for Dad's startup board," he explained. "I did not access their systems or send anyone private passwords. I sent a short notice identifying several suspicious transaction references already stored on the tablet and told them they needed to verify the records themselves." The board apparently took the warning seriously and opened its own internal review. But the real problem for Dad was not his startup investors. It was where the bulk of the missing money had actually come from. Malik clicked one final file, opening a scanned document that made my blood turn completely to ice. It was a partnership agreement for a massive commercial real estate venture. Malik turned the dual monitors fully around so I could see the screen clearly. He looked at me, his expression resolute and protective. Dad did not just steal from us, Mom. He stole hundreds of thousands of dollars. Look whose names are on these offshore accounts. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the highlighted names on the hidden banking ledgers. The primary victim of Jamal's massive embezzlement scheme was not a faceless bank or a group of wealthy tech investors. It was his own family. The names on the defrauded real estate accounts belonged to his older brother, Andre, and Andre's wife, Chloe. Jamal had been secretly bleeding his own brother's commercial real estate venture dry. I stared at the glowing pixels on my son's monitor, my breath completely catching in my throat. The names glaring back at me from the hidden offshore banking ledgers belonged to Andre Jamal's older brother and Chloe, Andre's white wife. My mind, wired for global supply chain tracking and inventory reconciliation, instantly recognized the sheer scale and audacity of the theft unfolding across the spreadsheets. Jamal had not just skimmed a little off the top to fund a weekend getaway. He had systematically engineered a massive financial pipeline designed to bleed his own flesh and blood completely dry. Andre and Chloe owned a lucrative portfolio of commercial real estate properties across the city. They had trusted Jamal to manage the properties, handle the commercial tenant acquisitions, and oversee the daily maintenance contractors. Looking closely at the digital ledgers Malik had uncovered, the mechanism of the betrayal became crystal clear. Jamal had been creating fake invoices for phantom plumbing repairs, commercial roof replacements, and elaborate landscaping services that never actually occurred. He would authorize these fraudulent payments from his brother's joint business account, route the funds through a dummy corporation registered in Delaware, and then quietly wash the money into an offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. Malik, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Scroll down to the total aggregate column for the current fiscal year. My son tapped the arrow key, navigating to the bottom of the complex spreadsheet. The final sum sat there in stark bold lettering: $245,000. Jamal had drained almost $250,000 from his brother and sister-in-law's commercial real estate accounts in less than 10 months. The $50,000 forged loan he took out against our home was just a desperate last-minute cash grab to cover his tracks or supplement his rapidly expanding lifestyle when the real estate funds were not moving fast enough. I need you to show me what else is in that secondary folder, I instructed, leaning closer to the desk. The one labeled with the current year expenses. Malik clicked his mouse, backing out of the real estate ledgers and opening a separate directory. This one was far less sophisticated but infinitely more enraging. It was a digital paper trail of complete financial infidelity. I watched as document receipts and digital invoices flooded the screen. There was the $20,000 down payment for the pristine white Mercedes-Benz that Jasmine had been driving when she laid on the horn in my driveway. There was a signed lease agreement for a luxury penthouse apartment downtown, complete with a $12,000 security deposit paid via wire transfer from the offshore account. There were receipts for designer handbags, five-star resort weekend, getaways, and wildly expensive jewelry. How was funding an entire fake billionaire lifestyle using stolen family money? He was buying a 24-year-old intern, the illusion of a wildly successful tech entrepreneur, all while tearing apart the financial security of his wife, his son, and his own older brother. The cold, calculating logistics of his betrayal completely extinguished any lingering trace of grief I might have still harbored for my dead marriage. I did not feel sad. I felt a dangerous, terrifying clarity. Jamal was not a misguided husband going through a midlife crisis. He was a professional parasite, a highly destructive financial predator who had grown careless because he believed the people around him were too stupid to ever look past his charming smile and expensive tailored suits. I placed my hand gently over Malik's hand, stopping him from clicking any further into the files. "You have done more than enough, my brilliant boy," I told him, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "I am so incredibly proud of how smart you are, but you need to step away from this now. I am taking this over. This is a grown-up war, and I am not letting you carry the weight of your father's crimes." I retrieved a high-capacity encrypted external hard drive from my own home office down the hall. I plugged it into Malik's computer and began the methodical process of copying every single file ledger invoice and geolocation metadata tag. I backed up the proof of my forged signature. I saved the offshore routing numbers. I duplicated the fake contractor invoices and the luxury car receipts. I made 2 separate copies, ensuring that no matter what happened, the evidence would remain entirely secure. Once the backup was complete, I told Malik not to open another file. We disconnected Jamal's old tablet from the network, but changed absolutely nothing on the device. I preserved it exactly as we had found it and placed it beside the encrypted backup, so Donovan could determine the proper chain of custody and decide what investigators should obtain independently. As I safely ejected the hard drive and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan, the quiet atmosphere of the bedroom was suddenly pierced by the sharp, vibrating buzz of my cell phone. I had left it sitting on Malik's bed when I walked in. I picked up the device expecting another frantic, screaming phone call from Jamal demanding that I unfreeze his accounts. Instead, the screen was illuminated by a text message notification. It was from Chloe, Andre's wife. Chloe and I had never been close. She came from a wealthy background and always carried herself with an air of subtle superiority, treating me less like a sister-in-law and more like an employee who had somehow managed to marry into her social circle. She constantly defended Jamal's questionable business practices, claiming he just needed more time to find his true path, while silently judging me for being the primary breadwinner in my household. She often made passive-aggressive remarks about how my demanding corporate career was stripping away my femininity, suggesting that a real woman would focus on nurturing her husband's dreams rather than competing with him. I unlocked the phone and opened the message. It was a picture sent directly to our extended family group chat, a chat I had not yet removed myself from. The photograph showed the interior of one of the most exclusive, expensive steakhouses in the city. Sitting around a lavishly decorated table were Andre, Chloe, Jamal's mother Brenda, and sitting right in the center of the group, looking smug and radiant, were Jamal and Jasmine. They were all holding up crystal champagne flutes, smiling brightly for the camera. Jasmine was wearing a new diamond necklace, leaning her head affectionately against Jamal's shoulder. Chloe had added a highly public passive-aggressive caption beneath the photograph. "So glad to finally have positive energy in this family. Wishing Jamal and Jasmine a beautiful new chapter filled with success and authentic love." I stared at the photograph, absorbing the sheer spectacular irony of the image. Chloe was sitting there wearing her designer clothes, drinking expensive champagne, and smiling brightly next to the man who was actively and systematically draining her life savings to buy the very jewelry hanging around his mistress's neck. She was publicly celebrating my devastation, completely oblivious to the fact that her own financial ruin was sitting right across the table, sipping a cocktail paid for with her stolen real estate funds. My mother-in-law. Brenda was grinning in the background, validating her golden child's new relationship, completely unaware of the absolute catastrophe heading toward her own doorstep. They were all aligned against me, united in their belief that I was the bitter, career-obsessed woman who had held Jamal back from his true potential. They had chosen their side. They had welcomed the mistress with open arms and decided I was entirely disposable. A slow, steady calm washed over my entire body. I did not feel the urge to cry, and I did not feel the need to argue. I simply looked down at the encrypted hard drive resting securely in my pocket. I had the geolocation data proving a federal forgery. I had the offshore routing numbers proving massive corporate embezzlement. I had the receipts proving where every single stolen dollar had gone. I typed a very simple response into the family group chat. I told them the dinner looked absolutely lovely and that I sincerely hoped they enjoyed the evening. I turned my phone on silent, tucked it away, and walked out of my son's room. It was time to call my lawyer. It was time to prepare the battlefield. The sun had barely risen over the city skyline when I pulled my car into the parking garage of my attorney's office. I had not slept a single minute the night before. Instead, I had stayed awake, drinking black coffee and guarding the encrypted hard drive my son had given me as if it were a fragile newborn child. I walked into the sleek glass and steel building precisely at 8 in the morning. My lawyer, a sharp, fiercely intelligent man named Donovan, was already waiting for me in his corner office. I sat down across from his massive oak desk and silently slid the small silver hard drive across the polished wood. I told him that I did not just have proof of the $50,000 forgery. I told him I had the entire financial anatomy of a massive offshore embezzlement scheme. Donovan raised an eyebrow, plugged the drive into his secure offline terminal, and began to scroll. I watched his professional, composed demeanor completely fracture. I took off his reading glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and let out a long, heavy breath. He looked at me with absolute disbelief and asked how I had managed to obtain highly classified dual banking ledgers that would normally take a team of federal agents months to subpoena. I simply smiled and told him that arrogant men never change their passwords. Before discussing strategy, Donovan made one thing absolutely clear. Malik's files were investigative leads, not automatically admissible courtroom evidence, simply because we possessed copies of them. The original bank records, cloud records, transaction logs, and corporate documents would have to be obtained through proper legal process and independently authenticated by investigators. That distinction mattered enormously to me. Malik had shown us where the truth was buried. He had not been asked to prove a federal criminal case. From this point forward, adults with subpoenas, warrants, and proper legal authority would do that work. Donovan spent the next 2 hours meticulously analyzing the metadata files, the geolocation pings, and the offshore routing numbers. When he finally leaned back in his leather chair, the strategy was perfectly clear. The $50,000 home equity line of credit was the easiest battle we had to fight. Because we possessed the concrete digital proof that Jamal had authorized the electronic signature from a completely different state, while I was attending a supply chain conference. The evidence gave us an extremely strong basis to formally dispute my liability and require the bank to complete a fraud review before attempting to collect the debt from me. And the foreclosure threat hanging over my home would be entirely neutralized. The house I had built for my son was safe. But the secondary folder, the one containing the complex web of phantom contractors and offshore wire transfers, was a completely different beast. Donovan looked me dead in the eye and explained the sheer gravity of what my husband had done. This was not a simple civil dispute over marital assets. This was wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and interstate money laundering. Jamal had crossed a very severe legal line. Donovan warned me that once the evidence was formally referred to investigators, the criminal case would move beyond the boundaries of our divorce. If the original records confirmed what Malik had discovered, Jamal could be facing a substantial federal prison sentence, depending on the charges prosecutors were ultimately able to prove. I did not blink. I did not hesitate. I told Donovan to prepare the legal packets. I was not going to protect a predator who had actively tried to leave his own child homeless. I left Donovan's office feeling a profound sense of clarity and absolute control. The paralyzing anxiety that had gripped me since Monday was entirely gone. I drove back to my house, pulled my laptop out of my work bag, and began sorting through my corporate emails to catch up on what I had missed during my emergency leave. As I scrolled through my inbox, a new message notification popped up on the screen. It was not a work email. The sender was listed as Andre Jamal's older brother. He had copied his wife Chloe and my mother-in-law Brenda on the message. I opened the email expecting another toxic barrage of insults or demands that I sell my late father's vintage car. Instead, the tone of the message was shockingly formal, dripping with a cold, condescending corporate superiority. Andre wrote that the family was requesting my mandatory presence at a formal meeting the following evening. They had reserved a private dining room at one of the most exclusive, expensive restaurants in the downtown district. The purpose of the meeting, according to Andre, was to officially discuss my financial obligations to Jamal's business debt. I read the next paragraph of the email and actually laughed out loud in my empty living room. Andre and Chloe had written a lengthy, patronizing lecture about personal responsibility. They stated that Jamal had confided in them about the true nature of our marriage. According to their email, Jamal claimed that my reckless spending habits and my refusal to financially support our household had forced him into a corner. He had completely gaslit his family into believing that I was the one who had drained our joint accounts. He told them that he had no choice but to take out the $50,000 home equity loan just to keep our family afloat. He painted himself as a desperate, loving father who had been driven to extreme measures by a selfish, career-obsessed wife. The email concluded with a firm, arrogant demand. Andre stated that the family was stepping in to protect Jamal's mental health and his future. They expected me to arrive at the restaurant prepared to sign a formal agreement, taking full legal ownership of the $50,000 debt. If I agreed to walk away quietly and assume the financial burden, they generously offered to facilitate a peaceful divorce. If I refused, they threatened to deploy their own high-powered legal team to destroy me in court. They honestly believed they were holding all the cards. They believed Jamal's pathetic narrative because it fit perfectly into the bitter, unsupportive wife stereotype they had always assigned to me. They were marching confidently onto a battlefield, completely unaware that I was holding the nuclear launch codes. I did not respond with anger. I did not defend myself or try to explain the truth over an email. I simply hit reply, typed a polite brief confirmation that I would be attending the family meeting, and pressed send. Then I closed my laptop and walked upstairs to my bedroom closet. This was not going to be a screaming match. This was going to be a structured, systematic execution. If I was going to walk into a lion's den surrounded by people who despised me, I was going to look absolutely flawless doing it. I bypassed my standard daily office wear and reached for my favorite power suit. It was a sharp, impeccably tailored emerald green blazer with matching trousers, a suit that commanded immediate respect and projected absolute authority. I laid the suit out on my bed, paired it with a crisp silk blouse and my most intimidating pair of pointed stiletto heels. I wanted Jamal to look at me and instantly regret every single choice he had made. I wanted Chloe to look at my tailored silhouette and feel her own artificial superiority crumble under the weight of my quiet confidence. But the wardrobe was just the packaging. The real preparation happened down in my home office. I fired up my high-quality laser printer and loaded it with thick premium presentation paper. I opened the encrypted files Donovan and I had organized earlier that morning. I was not going to rely on digital screens or laptops for this confrontation. I wanted physical, undeniable paper receipts that I could literally slide across the mahogany table and force them to look at. I printed the geolocation maps proving the forged signature, placing the pages into a crisp, transparent folder. Next, I printed the receipts for Jasmine's luxury downtown apartment lease and the $20,000 down payment for her white Mercedes. I highlighted the dates and the routing numbers with a bright yellow marker, making the timeline of his financial infidelity impossible to ignore. Finally, I printed the offshore banking ledgers. I printed the fake contractor invoices Jamal had used to funnel money out of Andre and Chloe's real estate venture. I highlighted the total sum of $245,000. I bound these specific documents in a separate heavy black folder. I stacked the folders neatly on my desk, running my hand over the smooth covers. The amount of damage contained within those few sheets of paper was staggering. Tomorrow night, they were going to sit in a private dining room, drink expensive wine, and try to force me into a corner. They were going to try to intimidate me into paying for the very same mistress their stolen money was currently funding. I packed the folders carefully into my structured leather tote bag, ensuring they remained absolutely crisp and perfect. I zipped the bag closed, feeling the solid, heavy weight of the truth resting comfortably against my shoulder. The long, exhausting years of biting my tongue, of shrinking myself down to protect his fragile ego, and of quietly enduring his family's endless disrespect were officially over. I was finally ready. The ultimate trap was set, and the family was eagerly walking right into it. The evening air was crisp as I pulled my car up to the valet stand of the most exclusive steakhouse in the downtown financial district. I handed over my keys with a polite nod, smoothing the lapels of my tailored emerald green blazer. I took a deep, steadying breath and walked through the heavy glass double doors. The restaurant was a masterclass in understated wealth, featuring dark wood paneling, dim ambient lighting, and the low hum of expensive conversations. I gave the hostess my name, and she immediately guided me toward the private dining suites in the back of the establishment. My heart maintained a slow, deliberate rhythm. The nervous, frantic wife who had cried in her kitchen just 5 days ago was completely gone. In her place stood a woman who knew the exact measure of her own power. The hostess pushed open a set of frosted glass doors, revealing the private room. It was a spacious, elegant area centered around a long, polished mahogany table. They were all already there, arranged like a royal court, holding an audience for a disobedient subject. Jamal sat at the head of the table wearing a custom suit that I had undoubtedly paid for. Jasmine sat perched right next to him wearing a sleek cocktail dress and the diamond necklace he had bought with his brother's stolen money. To his left sat his mother, Brenda, her posture rigid and her face arranged in stern disappointment, and to Brenda sat Andre Jamal's older brother looking annoyed by this domestic disruption. And sitting right beside Andre was his white wife Chloe, swirling a glass of expensive red wine with her air of absolute unearned superiority. Sitting at the far end of the table was a man I did not recognize, wearing a gray suit and holding a silver pen. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Jamal said, leaning back in his chair with a relaxed, arrogant posture. He did not look like a man whose business accounts had been frozen just 24 hours ago. He looked like a man who believed his rich older brother and his aggressive legal representation were about to save him from all his consequences. I walked over to the only empty chair left at the opposite end of the table and sat down, placing my structured leather tote bag carefully on the floor, right next to my pointed stiletto heels. I did not apologize for my timing, and I did not offer any warm greetings. I simply looked at the man in the gray suit, waiting for the charade to officially begin. Jamal cleared his throat, attempting to command the room. "Maya, this is Arthur, an attorney representing my new business interests. We invited you here tonight because your reckless emotional behavior this past week has caused some highly unnecessary complications." Arthur the lawyer folded his hands on top of the polished wood and gave me a tight professional smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Mrs. Davis," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "we are here to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to the financial strain currently affecting my client. As I am sure you are aware, your recent attempts to dispute the home equity line of credit have triggered a temporary freeze on certain assets. This is disrupting my client's ability to operate his new venture, and quite frankly, it is a pointless endeavor that will only drain your own resources in family court." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, sliding them right in front of me. I looked down at the pages. The top sheet was clearly labeled as a debt assumption and non-disclosure agreement. Arthur continued his well-rehearsed pitch, outlining the trap they had so confidently set. "The contract stipulates that you will legally assume full responsibility for the $50,000 home equity loan. In exchange, my client is willing to expedite the divorce proceedings without pursuing any claims against your personal retirement accounts or your primary salary. Additionally, the non-disclosure agreement requires you to refrain from discussing my client's financial status, his business operations, or his personal relationships with any outside parties." I sat perfectly still, letting his absurd words echo in the quiet private room. They wanted me to take the fall for a federal forgery so Jamal could walk away with a clean credit score. They wanted to silence me with a legal gag order so Jasmine could continue playing the role of the successful tech founder's girlfriend without anyone knowing she was riding around in a stolen car. It was an astonishing display of sheer delusional entitlement. I looked at Jamal, who was watching me with a smug, triumphant grin. He genuinely believed that placing a lawyer in front of me would intimidate me back into my usual role of the accommodating, silent, and deeply exhausted wife. Brenda let out a sigh from across the table, crossing her arms. "You need to sign the papers, Maya," she demanded, her tone dripping with maternal judgment. "Jamal has been through enough stress this week because of your little stunts with the bank. He is trying to build a future, and you are dragging him down out of bitterness. You need to accept that the marriage is over and stop trying to financially ruin him just because you are angry he found happiness somewhere else." Before I could even formulate a response to my mother-in-law's stunning display of ignorance, Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She gave me a deeply patronizing smile, tilting her head with that familiar look of artificial sympathy she always used when she wanted to put me in my place. "Maya, we all know you have always struggled to prioritize family over your corporate career. she said, her voice soft but laced with absolute poison. But you need to do the right thing as a mother now. If you drag this out in court and try to pin this debt on Jamal, you are going to ruin his new life, and ultimately, that is only going to hurt your son. We are willing to be generous here. If you sign the debt assumption agreement tonight, Andre and I will personally write you a check for $5,000 as a transitional allowance. It is more than fair considering you are the one who failed to support his vision in the first place. $5,000. Chloe was offering me a pathetic $5,000 allowance to stay quiet and shoulder a $50,000 forged debt, all while she sat there completely oblivious to the fact that her charming brother-in-law had actively stolen almost $250,000 from her own commercial real estate accounts. She thought she was the wealthy savior descending from her throne to rescue the bitter working-class ex-wife. She thought her money gave her the ultimate authority to dictate my reality. The sheer staggering irony of her condescension was almost too perfect. I looked around the table, making deliberate, unwavering eye contact with every single person in the room. I looked at Jasmine, who was busy checking her reflection in the blade of her butter knife. I looked at Brenda, who was nodding along with Chloe's ridiculous speech. I looked at Andre, who seemed entirely bored by the proceedings and eager to get back to his expensive steak. I looked at the lawyer who was waiting for me to pick up the silver pen and sign my life away. And finally, I looked at Jamal, who was leaning back with his arm draped comfortably around Jasmine's chair, absolutely certain that he had won. The silence stretched out for several long, tense seconds. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not defend my career or my choices as a mother. I slowly reached down toward the floor and unzipped the main compartment of my structured leather tote bag. The metal zipper sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. I slipped my hand inside and my fingers closed firmly around the thick, heavy folders I had meticulously prepared in my home office. "I am not signing your absurd contract," I said, my voice dropping into a register so calm and cold that the temperature in the room seemed to immediately plummet. The smug smile on Jamal's face faltered just a fraction of an inch. Chloe let out an exasperated scoff, rolling her eyes and reaching for her wine glass. I pulled the heavy folders out of my bag and placed them squarely on top of the blank non-disclosure agreement. I rested my hands flat against the dark covers, feeling the undeniable weight of the absolute truth. I looked directly into Jamal's panicked eyes and smiled. "If we are going to discuss financial obligations tonight," I said, "then let us talk about who really owes who." I kept my eyes locked on Jamal as I opened the clear, transparent folder. The quiet hum of the restaurant faded into the background, replaced entirely by the sound of my own steady breathing. I did not slide the first moment toward my arrogant husband or his patronizing sister-in-law. Instead, I bypassed family dynamics entirely and directed my attention to the only person at the table who was bound by legal ethics. I slid the crisp stack of papers directly across the polished mahogany wood toward Arthur. The attorney frowned slightly, looking down at the document as it came to rest right next to his silver pen. He clearly expected to see a desperate counteroffer or a financial plea for spousal support. What he actually received was a highly detailed forensic data log. I folded my hands together and began to explain the exact nature of the paperwork he was currently examining. I told Arthur that my husband had successfully secured a $50,000 home equity line of credit using a digital signature verification system. I kept my voice perfectly modulated, ensuring every single syllable landed with absolute precision. The problem, Arthur, is that the digital signature was executed on a Tuesday afternoon at exactly 2 in the afternoon. I paused, letting the specific timing hang in the air. At that exact moment, I was standing on a convention center stage in Atlanta, delivering a keynote presentation on global supply chain logistics to an audience of 500 industry professionals. I was 3 states away, and I have the flight records, the hotel receipts, and the digital conference logs to prove my exact location. Arthur adjusted his gray suit jacket and picked up the first page. His eyes scanned the highlighted sections I had so carefully prepared in my home office. I watched his professional composure begin to crack. I explained that the document he was holding contained the specific Internet Protocol metadata extracted directly from the loan authorization sequence. I told him that the geolocation tag attached to that digital signature did not originate from Atlanta. It did not even originate from our family home. The data pinged directly back to a luxury apartment building located right here in the downtown district. I turned my head slightly and looked directly at Jasmine. The very same luxury apartment building where your client currently resides with his marketing intern. The air in the private dining room suddenly felt incredibly thin. The smug, confident smile that Jamal had worn since I walked into the restaurant faltered. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to maintain his posture, but the sheer panic was beginning to leak through his facade. He let out a loud, dismissive laugh, throwing his hands up in the air as if I had just told a ridiculous joke. "Maya, you are being completely paranoid," he said, his voice pitching slightly higher than usual. "You are confusing standard banking glitches with some kind of crazy conspiracy. I authorized that loan with your full verbal consent. You probably just forgot because you are always so stressed and distracted with your corporate job." I did not even dignify his pathetic gaslighting with a response. I kept my gaze firmly fixed on his legal representation. Arthur was no longer looking at Jamal. The attorney had turned completely pale and his knuckles were white as he gripped the edges of the forensic report. As a legal professional, Arthur immediately understood the staggering gravity of the documents sitting in front of him. He knew that properly authenticated banking metadata could become extremely powerful evidence in a financial fraud case. He also knew that his client had not just lied to a spouse in a messy divorce proceeding. Jamal had committed a severe federal crime by manipulating a financial institution across state lines. The realization that his own client had blindly dragged him into the middle of an active felony investigation washed over the lawyer's face. Arthur slowly placed the documents back down on the table and pushed his chair back slightly, physically distancing himself from my husband. Jamal looked at his attorney, clearly expecting the man to launch a fierce legal defense. "Arthur, what is this nonsense?" Jamal demanded, his voice tightening with genuine anxiety. "Tell her this is inadmissible. Tell her she cannot just print out random internet numbers and threaten me." Arthur did not speak. The attorney simply stared at the metadata logs, completely paralyzed by the profound legal jeopardy his client had just orchestrated. The silence from the defense was absolutely deafening. Seeing her golden child suddenly floundering, Brenda decided to intervene. My mother-in-law slammed her hand down on the table, causing the crystal wine glasses to rattle against the wood. "You listen to me right now, Maya," she demanded, her voice shrill and dripping with misplaced maternal outrage. "You are sitting here trying to ruin my son over a technicality. So what if he signed the paperwork for you? You are his wife. That house belongs to both of you, and that money is just family money anyway. He needed that capital to build a future, and you are acting like he robbed a bank. You should be ashamed of yourself for trying to send the father of your child to prison just because you are bitter about his new relationship." I slowly turned my head to face Brenda. The absolute sheer delusion of her defense was almost impressive. She was perfectly willing to excuse a $50,000 federal fraud because it protected her precious son from facing any real consequences for his actions. I did not raise my voice, but I infused every single word with a cold, unyielding authority. "It is not family money, Brenda," I told her clearly and deliberately. "It is my money. I paid the mortgage. I paid the property taxes. I built the equity in that house while your son drained our joint accounts to fund his endless string of pathetic failures." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the mahogany table. "And as for protecting the father of my child," I continued, my eyes locking onto hers, "I am doing exactly what a good mother should do. I am protecting my son's future from a predator who tried to leave him homeless to finance a luxury car for his mistress." You can sit there and defend a felon all you want, Brenda, but the federal government does not care about your golden child complex. The bank is already processing the fraud claim, and that $50,000 debt is going to fall entirely on his shoulders. The reality of the situation finally seemed to penetrate Brenda's stubborn defensive wall. She looked at Jamal, her eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization that she could not shield him from a federal indictment. Jamal was sweating visibly now. The confident, arrogant posture had entirely evaporated, replaced by the frantic, nervous energy of a man watching his entire house of cards catch fire. Jasmine shifted away from him, her manicured hands gripping her expensive purse as the romantic illusion of her wealthy, successful entrepreneur boyfriend began to rapidly deteriorate. The entire dynamic of the room had been completely violently overturned. I had systematically dismantled their legal threat, their financial leverage, and their false narrative in less than 10 minutes. Chloe let out a long, exasperated sigh, clearly annoyed that her elegant dinner was being ruined by this dramatic display of financial accountability. Maya, this is all very dramatic, she said, rolling her eyes and taking a long sip of her expensive red wine. But honestly, this is exactly why Jamal wanted to leave. You are so obsessed with tracking every single penny. If he took $50,000, so what? Andre and I have lost more than that in stock market fluctuations in a single afternoon. You are making a massive federal case out of pocket change just to punish him. It is truly embarrassing for everyone involved here today. I looked at Chloe, watching the artificial light catch the facets of her heavy diamond jewelry. She felt so incredibly safe in her little bubble of massive commercial real estate wealth. She honestly believed that her massive bank accounts made her completely untouchable. She believed that my financial struggles were petty and insignificant compared to her vast fortunes. I reached deeply down into my structured leather tote bag, and my fingers closed around the heavy black folder containing the hidden dual ledgers. I slowly pulled the second thick black folder out, placing it squarely on top of the table. I looked directly at Andre and Chloe, letting a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the dark cover. You think $50,000 is just pocket change, Chloe? I asked, my voice dropping into a quiet, deadly whisper. I agree with you completely, but that is not the money you should be worried about. I kept my hand resting firmly on the thick black cover of the second folder, letting the silence in the private dining room stretch out until it became physically uncomfortable. The ambient noise of the restaurant outside the frosted glass doors seemed to fade completely away, leaving only the sound of clinking silverware and shallow breathing. Andre let out a loud, arrogant laugh, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. He crossed his arms over his broad chest and looked at me as if I had completely lost my mind. He told me that I was embarrassing myself, and that $50,000 was absolute pocket change compared to the millions he and his younger brother were going to make with their upcoming commercial real estate developments. He looked at Jamal with a proud, brotherly smile, completely oblivious to the fact that the man sitting next to him was sweating profusely. I smiled back at Andre, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my voice entirely devoid of any emotion. I told Andre that his unwavering faith in his family was incredibly touching, but unfortunately it was entirely misplaced. I opened the heavy black folder, and the sharp, crisp sound of the turning pages echoed loudly across the long mahogany table. I pulled out the first thick stack of documents and slid them directly across the polished wood toward Andre. I told him to look very closely at the commercial property maintenance records for the past 10 months. My years of intensive experience working as a director of supply chain logistics had trained my brain to identify invoice discrepancies, inventory anomalies, and vendor irregularities with absolute clinical precision. I explained to the table that Jamal had been actively exploiting his position as the lead property manager for their joint real estate venture. I walked them through the exact mechanism of the theft, ensuring that every single person in the room understood the sheer massive scale of the betrayal. I detailed how Jamal had systematically created an entire network of phantom contractors and fraudulent vendor accounts. He had submitted massive invoices for commercial roof repairs on buildings that did not even have the type of roofs listed in the service contracts. He had billed their shared company for extensive plumbing overhauls that never existed, and for elaborate luxury landscaping services on industrial properties that were entirely paved in concrete. I explained that Jamal would authorize these fraudulent payments using his executive access to their shared business checking accounts. Then he would immediately route the stolen funds through a dummy corporation registered to a remote post office box in Delaware, before quietly washing the clean money into an untraceable offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. Andre did not even bother to pick up the paperwork sitting right in front of him. He violently pushed the stack of documents back across the table toward me, his face twisting with angry disbelief and fierce, blind, brotherly loyalty. He pointed his finger directly at my face and raised his voice, calling me a bitter, scorned woman who was desperately fabricating lies because I could not handle the fact that my marriage was over. He told me that Jamal was his own flesh and blood, his best friend, and that his brother would never steal a single dime from their family legacy. He aggressively defended Jamal, claiming that I was just trying to sabotage their highly lucrative business partnership out of pure malicious spite because I was jealous of their success. He reminded the table that Jamal had always been the visionary of the family, while I was just a rigid corporate drone who lacked imagination. Brenda immediately joined the loud chorus of family denial, nodding vigorously and declaring that Jamal was a good, honest man who was being persecuted by an evil, vindictive wife who never appreciated his genius. Jamal tried to put on a brave face, nodding along with his mother and his brother, but I could see the absolute stark terror vibrating in his hands. He kept swallowing hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the door, as if he was calculating the exact physical distance required to run away from his rapidly crumbling life. But Chloe did not join the loud, aggressive chorus of family denial. Chloe came from generational wealth, and she possessed a very sharp, analytical mind when it came to protecting her personal fortune. While her husband was busy yelling insults at me to protect his younger brother, Chloe quietly reached across the table and pulled the thick stack of documents toward herself. She completely ignored the chaotic noise in the room and picked up the first page, her eyes immediately scanning the bright yellow highlighted sections I had so carefully prepared earlier that afternoon. I watched her expression transform in real time. The patronizing artificial sympathy she had worn all evening completely vanished, replaced by a look of profound horror. Her face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of pale as she stared directly at the internal account routing numbers printed on the fraudulent invoices. Chloe recognized her own highly secure private banking details. She saw the specific wire transfers that bypassed their joint security protocols. The reality of the betrayal was sinking deep into her bones. She had always treated me like an outsider, a mere employee who married into their elite circle, but now she was looking at the undeniable fact that her own inner circle had robbed her blind. She saw the exact dates of the massive withdrawals matching perfectly with the specific times Jamal had called them, claiming he needed emergency capital for building repairs and tenant acquisitions. She flipped rapidly to the second page and then the third, her manicured fingernails trembling slightly against the crisp, heavy paper. She was reading the undeniable digital trail of her own financial ruin. She saw the Delaware Shell Company documentation. She saw the offshore account authorizations that my brilliant son Malik had pulled directly from Jamal's synced tablet. The undeniable proof was sitting right there in her shaking hands. Jamal suddenly panicked, realizing that his wealthy sister-in-law was actually comprehending the data and connecting the dots. He reached across the table, trying to physically pull the papers out of her hands, begging her not to listen to my manipulated numbers. He told her I was an expert at spreadsheets and that I was just trying to tear their strong family apart with fake math. But Chloe yanked the heavy folder away from his grasping fingers, her eyes blazing with a sudden furious realization. She looked at her husband, who was still loudly defending his brother, and told him to shut his mouth immediately. The sharp, venomous tone in her voice instantly silenced the entire room. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my folded hands, completely savoring the beautiful destruction of their smug, toxic alliance. I told Chloe to look at the fourth page in the packet, focusing specifically on the highlighted aggregate total at the very bottom of the expense column. I spoke the number out loud, enunciating every single syllable so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. $245,000. I let the massive, staggering sum hang heavily in the quiet air of the private dining room. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of Jamal taking short, frantic breaths. I watched as Andre finally stopped talking, his confident, broad posture completely deflating as the reality of that number finally hit his brain. He looked at the paperwork and then looked at his younger brother, his eyes searching for any sign of a denial that Jamal simply could not provide. Jamal had drained almost $250,000 from their private accounts in less than 10 months. But I was not quite finished delivering the absolute truth. I guided Chloe's attention to the fifth page in the folder. I told her to look at an outgoing wire transfer for exactly $20,000 dated exactly 3 weeks ago. I watched her vibrant green eyes track the highlighted line, matching the date and the specific withdrawal from her personal investment portfolio. Then I asked Chloe a very simple, devastating question. I asked her if she happened to notice the pristine, brand new white Mercedes-Benz that Jasmine had parked with the valet outside the restaurant tonight. Chloe slowly looked up from the financial ledgers, her gaze shifting directly across the table to where Jasmine was sitting frozen in absolute fear. She looked at the young marketing intern sitting there in her designer cocktail dress. Chloe's eyes slowly moved from Jasmine's terrified pale face directly down to the heavy sparkling diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. The horrific, devastating realization finally struck her with the force of a speeding freight train as she understood exactly whose stolen money had purchased that luxury vehicle and that expensive jewelry. The realization did not just dawn on Chloe, it violently detonated inside her mind. The heavy crystal wine glass she had been swirling slipped from her perfectly manicured fingers and shattered against the polished mahogany table, sending a wave of dark red wine splashing across the white linen napkins. Chloe did not even flinch at the sound of the breaking glass. She shot up from her chair with such explosive force that the heavy wooden seat tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the carpeted floor. All of the artificial corporate composure she had worn like a shield, all evening completely evaporated in a single fraction of a second. She lunged across the wide table, her hands reaching out blindly as she screamed at the absolute top of her lungs. She aimed directly for Jasmine, trying to grab the sparkling diamond necklace resting against the young intern collarbone. Jasmine shrieked in genuine terror and scrambled backward, her designer chair scraping harshly against the floor as she tried to put as much physical distance between herself and the furious wealthy woman she had unwittingly helped rob. Andre had to physically throw his arms around his wife, waist pulling her away from the center of the table. Chloe was thrashing wildly, her voice entirely hoarse as she demanded her money back. She screamed at Jamal, calling him a pathetic parasite who had financed a fake billionaire lifestyle using her generational wealth. She pointed a shaking finger at Jasmine, yelling that the young intern was driving around town in a luxury vehicle paid for with stolen commercial real estate funds. The sheer volume of her rage echoed loudly off the walls of the private dining room, drowning out the soft ambient music piping in from the main restaurant. Andre struggled to restrain his wife, but his own face was rapidly changing from aggressive brotherly denial to absolute horrifying comprehension. The fierce, blind loyalty he had weaponized against me just 5 minutes ago completely shattered as he looked at the terrified, guilty expression plastered across Jamal's face. Andre finally realized that his younger brother had not just taken a few extra dollars to float a struggling business venture. Jamal had actively, methodically, and mercilessly drained $250,000 from their shared legacy. Andre let go of his wife and stepped forward, placing both of his hands flat on the table and leaning aggressively toward his brother. The booming, authoritative voice, Andre usually reserved for ruthless business negotiations, completely filled the small room as he demanded an immediate explanation. He asked Jamal if the spreadsheets were real. Jamal could not even look his older brother in the eye. The golden child of the family was physically shrinking in his expensive custom-tailored suit, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic implosion of his highly guarded secret life. Desperation is a highly predictable human emotion, and Jamal was nothing if not entirely predictable when backed into a corner. Instead of taking an ounce of personal responsibility for the federal crimes he had committed, he reverted to the only defensive strategy he had ever truly known. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me and tried to spin a web of absolute fiction. Jamal raised his voice above Chloe, furious sobbing, and told Andre that I was a bitter, vindictive corporate manager who was trying to frame him. He wildly claimed that I was the one who had hacked into the commercial real estate network. He told his brother that I had set up the Delaware shell corporations and the Cayman Islands offshore accounts to deliberately sabotage his reputation during our messy divorce proceedings. I desperately tried to convince his family that my high-level experience in global supply chain logistics gave me the exact technical skills required to fabricate the complex financial spreadsheets currently sitting on the table. He begged his older brother to believe that this entire night was just an elaborate, malicious trap designed by a jealous woman who could not handle being replaced by a younger, more vibrant partner. I did not raise my voice to defend my character. I did not interrupt his pathetic spiraling monologue or engage in a screaming match over his ridiculous accusations. I simply let him dig his own grave a few feet deeper. When Jamal finally ran out of breath, I slowly reached back into my structured leather tote bag. I pulled out a third transparent folder and placed it deliberately on the mahogany table right next to the massive pile of damning financial ledgers. I slid this new packet of documents directly toward Andre. I kept my voice incredibly calm and perfectly level as I explained exactly what Andre was about to read. I told the table that the documents contained the highly secure network transfer logs provided directly by the Bank Fraud Division. I explained that when a person transfers $250,000 into an offshore shell account, they leave an undeniable digital footprint. I pointed to the bright yellow highlighted sections on the top page, detailing the exact Internet Protocol addresses used to authorize every single fraudulent transaction over the past 10 months. I watched Andre's eyes trace the data logs. I told him that none of the illegal wire transfers originated from my corporate office. Not a single transfer originated from our suburban family home. I explained that every single massive withdrawal from the commercial real estate fund had been authorized using the private local area network registered to a luxury downtown penthouse. The exact same luxury downtown penthouse where Jamal and Jasmine were currently residing. I told Andre to look closely at the timestamp on the final $20,000 transfer, which occurred precisely at midnight on a Tuesday. I reminded the room that at midnight on that specific Tuesday, I was sleeping in my own bed while Jamal had claimed he was pulling an all-night strategy session at his startup incubator. The geographical data was absolute and unforgiving. It completely obliterated Jamal's desperate attempt to frame me. Andre slowly looked up from the Internet Protocol. Data logs, his face completely devoid of any remaining brotherly affection. The absolute realization that Jamal had not only robbed him, but had just attempted to falsely imprison an innocent woman to cover his own tracks, destroyed the final remnants of their lifelong familial bond. Andre turned toward Jamal with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The loud, booming anger had been replaced by a quiet, dangerous fury. I told Jamal that he was completely dead to him. Chloe was still standing near the wall, wiping mascara from her cheeks and breathing heavily, her eyes locked onto the diamond necklace resting on Jasmine's chest. The young intern was shaking silently, looking around the room as if she was trying to find a magical escape hatch that would rescue her from the nightmare she had willingly walked into. Arthur, the legal representation they had brought to intimidate me, sat perfectly motionless at the far end of the long table. The attorney had not spoken a single word since I handed him the proof of the forged home equity loan. He was simply watching the total collapse of his client life, with the detached clinical horror of a man realizing he needed to formally withdraw his legal services before the federal authorities arrived. The entire power structure of the room had been violently, permanently dismantled. The smug, unified front that had greeted me when I first walked through the frosted glass doors was now a chaotic, fractured mess of profound betrayal and bitter financial ruin. In the midst of this absolute destruction, Brenda suddenly tried to intervene. My mother-in-law stood up from her chair, holding her hands out in a desperate plea for family unity. She looked frantically between her two sons, begging them to calm down and remember that they were blood. She pleaded with Andre not to let money tear their beautiful family apart. She told him that Jamal had simply made a terrible mistake and that they could work together to pay the funds back over time. She tried to employ the same toxic enabling tactics she had used for decades, desperately shielding her golden child from facing the very real severe consequences of his actions. She looked at me with tears welling in her eyes and demanded that I stop tearing her boys apart with my cruel paperwork. She told me that a good woman would help heal a family instead of deliberately destroying it for personal vengeance. I looked at Brenda, watching her desperately try to throw a blanket of maternal guilt over a massive federal crime scene. She still honestly believed that Jamal was just a misunderstood visionary who needed a little extra support. She still believed that she was safely insulated from the catastrophic blast radius of her youngest son, profound greed. I slowly reached into the very bottom of my leather tote bag, and my fingers brushed against the final crisp envelope I had prepared. I pulled the envelope out and held it firmly in my hands, feeling the heavy, devastating weight of its contents. I looked directly into Brenda, pleading tear-filled eyes, allowing a slow, cold realization to settle over my features. I told Brenda that her unwavering dedication to her golden child was truly remarkable. But then I slid the final pristine white envelope straight across the polished mahogany table until it came to rest directly in front of her trembling hands. I told my mother-in-law that she should probably open that envelope before she offered to help Jamal pay back his massive debts, because the absolute worst betrayal of the night was not sitting in the commercial real estate ledgers. Brenda stared at the crisp white envelope sitting on the polished mahogany table directly in front of her trembling hands. The fierce maternal outrage that had fueled her defense of Jamal just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a creeping primal dread. She looked up at me, her eyes begging me to take it back, to spare her from whatever devastating truth was hiding inside that thin paper seal. But I did not move, and I did not look away. I told her that she had spent her entire life protecting a man who saw her as nothing more than a convenient asset to exploit. I told her to open the envelope. Jamal let out a strangled, pathetic sound from the other end of the table. He lunged forward, stretching his arms across the wood, begging his mother not to look at the paperwork. He told her I was just trying to poison her mind with more fabricated corporate spreadsheets. But his sheer, unrestrained panic only confirmed her worst fears. Brenda slowly picked up the envelope. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely slide her finger under the flap. She pulled out a thick stack of formal legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. These were not digital logs or internet protocol addresses. These were binding, notarized financial contracts obtained directly from the commercial lending division of a major national bank. I watched her eyes dart across the top page, trying to comprehend the complex legal jargon. I decided to make it incredibly simple for her. I leaned back in my chair and projected my voice so that every single person in the private dining room could hear exactly how Jamal rewarded his mother for her unwavering loyalty. I told Brenda to look at the second page of the packet, specifically at the section detailing the collateral requirements for the massive commercial business loan her son had taken out 8 months ago. I reminded the room that Jamal had launched his tech startup with grand promises of venture capital funding and wealthy angel investors. But the truth, as proven by the documents Brenda was currently holding, was that institutional investors had taken one look at his business model and laughed him out of their boardrooms. He was completely broke, desperate to maintain the illusion of success for his new 24-year-old girlfriend. He needed a massive injection of cash to keep his fake empire afloat, and commercial banks require hard, tangible collateral. I watched Brenda flip to the second page. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. I explained that Jamal had quietly leveraged the only valuable asset he had access to. He had used her fully paid-off 4-bedroom retirement home. The home she and her late husband had spent 30 years paying for. The home where she had raised her children and planned to live out the rest of her days in peace and security. I detailed exactly how he had accomplished it. I reminded Brenda about the estate planning documents Jamal had asked her to sign last autumn, claiming he was just updating her living trust to protect her assets from heavy taxation. He had slipped the commercial loan guarantee paperwork right into the middle of that stack of documents, and she had signed on the dotted line without reading a single word because she trusted her golden child implicitly. She had literally signed away the deed to her own house to finance his massive fraud. Jamal began to weep openly at the table, burying his face in his hands, but I did not stop speaking. I instructed Brenda to look at the final page in the folder, which was a formal notice of default. I told her that Jamal had not made a single payment on that commercial loan in over 4 months. The bank was no longer granting extensions. The grace period had entirely expired. The document she was holding was an active binding notice of foreclosure. The bank was officially seizing her property. The profound, devastating reality of her situation hit Brenda with the brutal force of a physical blow. The paper slipped from her fingers and fluttered down to the floor. A low, agonizing wail tore from her throat, a sound so full of pure anguish that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The woman who had proudly called me a bitter, scorned wife just 10 minutes ago was now sobbing hysterically, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. She realized that she was about to lose everything. She was going to be thrown out onto the street entirely homeless, all because she had blindly enabled the greed of a financial predator. Jamal pushed his chair back and rushed around the table toward his mother. He fell to his knees beside her chair, grabbing her hands and sobbing right along with her. He begged her to forgive him, promising wildly that his startup was just on the verge of a massive breakthrough and that he would pay the bank back before they could finalize the eviction. But the spell was completely, permanently broken. Brenda looked down at her son, and for the very first time in his entire life, she did not see a visionary entrepreneur who just needed a little more support. She saw the monster he truly was. She violently ripped her hands away from his grasp, pushing him back so hard that he stumbled and fell onto the carpet. She screamed at him to get away from her, her voice raw and cracking with absolute devastation. She asked him how he could do this to his own mother, how he could steal the roof over her head to buy diamond necklaces for his mistress. Andre stood watching this horrifying scene unfold with cold, detached disgust. He had spent his entire life competing with Jamal for their mother's affection, always coming in second to the golden child, despite building a highly successful commercial real estate portfolio. Now he was watching that same golden child completely destroy their mother's life. Andre stepped forward, but not to comfort Brenda or to help his brother up from the floor. He pulled out his cell phone and called his attorney before contacting the police non-emergency line to report the suspected embezzlement. He looked down at Jamal and told him that he was reporting a $250,000 corporate embezzlement and that he fully intended to hand over all the banking ledgers to the federal authorities. He told his brother that he was going to rot in federal prison. The entire private dining room had devolved into a scene of absolute spectacular ruin. Chloe was still standing near the wall, glaring at Jamal with pure, unadulterated hatred, as she mentally calculated the hundreds of thousands of dollars missing from her personal investment accounts. Andre was calmly providing the responding agency with his information and explaining that he wanted to formally report the suspected embezzlement. Brenda was slumped over the mahogany table, weeping uncontrollably into her hands as she pictured the bank changing the locks on her front door. Arthur, the attorney, had already quietly packed his silver pen and his blank non-disclosure agreements into his leather briefcase, preparing to slip out the side door before the authorities arrived to question his highly toxic client. Jasmine stood perfectly still by the edge of the polished mahogany table. Her wide eyes darted quickly between the weeping Brenda and the furiously pacing Andre. I watched the young intern face as the glamorous illusion of her brand-new lifestyle shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She was 24 years old, ambitious and highly calculating. She had willingly hitched her wagon to a man she deeply believed was a rising tech visionary with endless deep pockets and a taste for the finer things in life. She had overlooked a loyal wife and a 12-year-old son entirely because the financial rewards seemed far too lucrative to pass up. Now the harsh fluorescent light of reality was exposing the ugly truth. Jamal was not a self-made millionaire. He was a fraud, a thief, and a soon-to-be federal inmate who had mortgaged his own mother's future to buy the very car Jasmine had parked outside. I sat back in my chair, keeping my posture entirely relaxed, and observed the fascinating mechanics of self-preservation. Jasmine did not shed a single tear for the man she had been affectionately clutching just 30 minutes ago. She did not kneel on the floor next to him, offering any comfort while his entire world imploded. Instead, her bright eyes grew incredibly cold. She looked down at Jamal, who was still sprawled on the carpet, desperately trying to apologize to Brenda. Jasmine slowly reached down and picked up her structured designer purse, tucking it firmly under her arm. The sudden movement caught Jamal's attention. He looked up, his face slick with sweat and tears, and saw his beautiful upgraded girlfriend preparing to abandon a sinking ship. Jamal scrambled up from the floor, his custom suit wrinkled and completely ruined. He reached out and grabbed Jasmine tightly by the wrist, his fingers digging into her skin. "Jasmine, wait," he pleaded, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Do not go. I can fix this. I just need a little time to move some assets around. We can call the investors. I can make this right. Please, you have to stay and support me through this." Jasmine looked at the hand gripping her wrist, her expression twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She did not see a partner in need. She saw a massive legal liability. She violently yanked her arm out of his tight grasp, taking a sharp step backward toward the frosted doors. "Fix this," she repeated, her voice dripping with sheer venom. "You do not have any assets to move around, Jamal. You are completely broke. You stole from your own brother, and you forged your wife's signature to buy me a car. You are going to federal prison." Jamal reached out again, stepping toward her with his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Baby, please," he begged, his arrogance entirely replaced by the whining tone of a cornered animal. "I did all of this for us. I just wanted to give you the life you truly deserved." Jasmine let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that echoed loudly in the tense room. "We are not a team, Jamal," she said, adjusting her designer coat. "I am 24 years old. I have my whole life ahead of me, and I am certainly not doing jail time for a broke liar. Do not ever contact me again." She turned her back on him completely, pushed open the heavy glass doors, and walked out of the private dining room without looking back a single time. The loud click of her stiletto heels faded completely down the quiet hallway, taking his last remaining shred of dignity with her. The departure of the young mistress left a heavy, suffocating silence in the wake of her clicking heels. Jamal stood near the doorway, staring blankly at the frosted glass, his chest heaving as he processed the sudden absolute abandonment. He slowly turned his gaze back to the long mahogany table, looking for any remaining lifeline. His eyes desperately landed on Arthur, the expensive corporate attorney he had hired to intimidate me. Arthur had been sitting at the far end of the table like a cold stone statue. The lawyer had not spoken a single syllable since I exposed everything. As a seasoned legal professional, Arthur understood exactly how toxic the current environment had become. He knew that the documents I brought did not just prove a civil breach of contract. They pointed toward a coordinated pattern of serious financial crimes, including suspected wire fraud, identity theft, and large-scale embezzlement. He also recognized that Jamal had brought him to this dinner under completely false pretenses, weaponizing his legal credentials to coerce an innocent woman into assuming a fraudulent debt. Arthur calmly reached for his silver fountain pen, unscrewed the cap, and placed it securely inside the breast pocket of his tailored gray suit. I gathered the blank non-disclosure agreements and the debt assumption contracts, stacking them into a neat pile. He did not look angry. He looked entirely detached, operating with the cold mechanical efficiency of a man severing a dangerous liability. He opened his premium leather briefcase and slid the documents inside, snapping the brass locks shut, with a loud, definitive click that made Jamal physically flinch. "Arthur, what are you doing?" Jamal asked, his voice trembling as he stepped toward the lawyer. "You are my representation. You need to figure out a strong defense strategy to stop Andre immediately." Arthur stood up from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket with slow, deliberate movements. He picked up his briefcase and looked directly at Jamal, his expression completely devoid of any professional courtesy. "I am not your representation, Jamal," Arthur stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You retained my services to facilitate a standard divorce settlement and a debt transfer. You explicitly withheld the fact that you committed federal forgery and systematically embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from a commercial real estate firm. Furthermore, you attempted to use my representation to pressure your wife into assuming a debt you allegedly obtained through fraud." Jamal raised his hands, shaking his head frantically. "No, that is not true. I can explain everything. I just need you to file an injunction. We can claim the evidence was obtained illegally. We can fight this, Arthur." Arthur did not entertain the desperate bargaining. He stepped around his chair, moving closer to the exit. "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel, effective immediately," the attorney announced, making sure every person in the room heard the official declaration. "My firm does not represent clients who conceal active federal felonies. I strongly advise you to seek criminal representation today." I doubt anyone reputable will take a case with a paper trail this catastrophic, Arthur finished. You will receive an invoice for my time tonight. Do not contact my office again. Arthur gave a brief, respectful nod in my direction, silently acknowledging the flawless, undeniable trap I had executed. Then he turned and walked out the exact same doors Jasmine had used just moments before. Jamal was now entirely stripped of his armor. His mistress had abandoned him in disgust. His aggressive legal representation had formally dumped him on the spot. His older brother Andre was entirely finished talking. Andre was standing by the far wall speaking quietly to a police dispatcher and officially reporting the massive corporate theft. His mother Brenda was still slumped over the table weeping brokenly as she faced the horrific reality of losing her retirement home to foreclosure. Chloe was pacing near the windows, her arms crossed tightly glaring at the man who had robbed her blind. The golden child had completely fallen from grace. The arrogant, untouchable entrepreneur was dead, leaving behind a terrified, broken man who finally realized he was entirely out of options. Jamal turned slowly toward my direction. I was still sitting at the opposite end of the mahogany table, my hands resting calmly over my structured leather tote bag. My emerald green power suit remained impeccably crisp, and my posture was perfectly straight. I had not raised my voice once the entire evening, yet I had systematically demolished his entire existence. Jamal took a hesitant step toward me. His knees wobbled, his expensive leather shoes dragging against the carpet. The false bravado was gone, replaced by a deep, pathetic vulnerability that made my stomach turn. He walked closer, his eyes wide and bloodshot, streaming fresh, hot tears. "Maya," he whispered, his voice cracking with the heavy weight of his impending ruin. "Maya, please." He took another step, and then his legs completely gave out beneath him. Jamal collapsed onto his knees right in the middle of the private dining room. The heavy thud of his body hitting the floor echoed loudly, but nobody moved to help him. Brenda did not rush to comfort him. Andre did not offer a hand to pull him up. I simply looked down at him from my chair, my expression completely neutral, watching him reap the exact harvest he had greedily planted. He crawled forward slightly, reaching his trembling hands out toward my pointed stiletto heels, though he did not dare actually touch me. He looked up at my face, his chest heaving as he gasped for air in the quiet room. "Maya, you cannot do this to me," he begged, his voice a pathetic high-pitched whine that sounded absolutely nothing like the confident man I had married 13 years ago. "You cannot give those ledgers to the authorities. If the federal prosecutors see that metadata, I am going to prison for years. I will not survive in there. You know I will not survive." I looked down at the man who had spent more than a decade taking advantage of my ambition, my absolute loyalty, and my steady corporate paycheck. I looked at the man who had forged my signature and confidently told me to figure out a $50,000 debt while his young mistress honked her horn in my driveway. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No lingering pity, no residual love, not even a spark of anger. Just a cold, satisfying sense of total closure. He had designed his own spectacular downfall, and I was merely the messenger delivering the consequences. "Please, Maya," Jamal cried, tears dripping off his chin and staining his expensive silk tie. "I am so sorry. I lost my mind. I was stressed, and I made terrible mistakes, but I can fix it. I will work for the rest of my life to pay Andre back. I will get Mom House out of foreclosure. I will do whatever you want. Just please do not turn over the evidence. We have a son together. You cannot send Malik father to a federal penitentiary. Please, Maya. We are still family. You have to help me fix this mess." The word family hung in the air, pathetic and desperate. He was using the very concept he had completely desecrated, hoping it would somehow serve as a magical shield against his own absolute destruction. I looked down at him and felt the last trace of uncertainty disappear. He had already used Malik's name once to excuse his betrayal, and now he was using our son again as a shield against consequences. I would not allow it. "You lost the right to hide behind the word family the moment you forged my signature and put our son's home at risk," I told him. "You did not think about Malik when you drained our savings. You did not think about him when you used stolen money to build a new life with Jasmine. And you certainly did not think about him when you dropped $50,000 of fraudulent debt in my kitchen and walked out the door." Jamal shook his head desperately. Maya, please. I remembered the expensive watch on his wrist that afternoon. The white Mercedes waiting in my driveway. The complete absence of remorse when he threw those papers in front of me and told me I would figure it out. So I gave him back the exact mercy he had given me. You made this mess, Jamal, I said quietly. Figure it out. Jamal let out a loud, agonizing wail that scraped painfully against my ears, burying his wet face entirely in his trembling hands, as the absolute finality of my words crushed his last remaining sliver of desperate hope. I slowly straightened my posture, meticulously smoothing the wrinkle-free fabric of my green blazer, and deliberately looked around the private dining room, fully taking in the spectacular, catastrophic wreckage his boundless, unchecked greed had caused. The once beautifully elegant space was now a living, breathing portrait of total, permanent, irreversible devastation. Andre was standing frantically near the heavy frosted glass exit doors, speaking rapidly and breathlessly into his expensive cell phone. His booming executive voice carried sharply across the quiet room as he spelled out his own younger brother, full legal name to the local police dispatcher, explicitly detailing the $250,000 corporate embezzlement scheme and loudly demanding that uniformed officers be immediately dispatched to the restaurant address. Chloe was pacing furiously back and forth right behind her husband, her flawless designer makeup completely ruined, as her face flushed with pure, unadulterated rage. She aggressively kicked the wooden chair out of her path, not caring about the damage it caused to the expensive restaurant furniture. She was loudly calculating exactly how many of her personal generational investment accounts had been maliciously drained to secretly finance a fake billionaire lifestyle for a 24-year-old marketing intern. Brenda was still heavily slumped over the polished mahogany table, her wrinkled hands tightly clutching the official foreclosure notice for her fully paid-off suburban retirement home. Her hysterical, breathless sobs perfectly echoed the tragic, undeniable reality of blindly enabling a dangerous financial predator for several decades. The entire carefully constructed artificial illusion of their wealthy, inherently superior family dynamic had been completely and publicly annihilated in a mere matter of minutes. I calmly picked up my structured leather tote bag from the carpeted floor, feeling the immensely satisfying emptiness inside, now that the heavy folders of devastating evidence had been properly delivered to their rightful targets. I slung the sturdy strap comfortably over my right shoulder and reached deliberately into the small interior zippered pocket. I pulled out a crisp, fresh $100 bill that I had specifically brought from home for this exact, highly anticipated moment. I walked gracefully over to my empty chair and calmly placed the green money flat on the polished wood of the long table, making absolutely sure it sat right next to my untouched crystal glass of expensive red wine. I wanted to make it abundantly clear to every single person remaining in that room that I was not leaving a single unpaid financial debt behind me. I had proudly paid my own way through every single day of this terribly unequal marriage, and I was certainly going to pay my own way out of it tonight. I did not say another word to anyone sitting in the room. I did not say a polite goodbye to the mother-in-law who had so easily blamed me for her son, blatant infidelity. I did not offer any parting financial wisdom to the arrogant brother-in-law who had loudly called me a bitter, scorned woman just half an hour ago. I simply turned my back on the entire catastrophic scene, leaving the money resting on the table, and walked purposefully toward the frosted glass doors. My stiletto heels clicked rhythmically and powerfully against the hardwood floor of the long hallway, each precise step pulling me further away from the deeply toxic environment that had suffocated my ambition and drained my spirit for over a decade. I pushed firmly through the heavy double-glass doors of the restaurant lobby and finally stepped out into the cool, crisp evening air of the bustling downtown financial district. The glowing city lights sparkled brilliantly against the dark night sky, and the loud ambient noise of the passing urban traffic felt incredibly grounding and remarkably real to my ears. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs completely with the fresh, invigorating air of my absolute newfound freedom. The heavy, crushing weight of Jamal's constant, greedy financial demands, his endless string of pathetic business failures, and his family's relentless emotional manipulation was finally permanently lifted off my tired shoulders forever. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound relief washing over my entire body like a warm, comforting wave of pure energy. I had bravely walked into a highly coordinated hostile ambush, completely surrounded by people who desperately wanted to destroy my hard-earned professional reputation and force me into total financial ruin, and I had systematically dismantled every single one of them, using nothing but undeniable digital truth and meticulous careful preparation. The immediate brutal battle was officially over, and my personal victory was absolutely complete in every single way. But as I confidently handed my valet ticket to the young parking attendant and waited patiently for my car to be brought around to the concrete curb, my sharp analytical mind was already shifting its intense focus entirely toward the beautiful and bright future. The emotional war had been decisively won on the bloody battlefield of that upscale private dining room, but the practical logistical war was really just beginning for me. I still had to permanently secure the bright legal and financial future for myself and my incredibly brilliantly talented young son Malik. The crisp evening air of the downtown financial district filled my lungs as I handed the valet my ticket. I stood on the concrete curb watching the city traffic flow in a steady illuminated stream. I had walked into that upscale restaurant carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of financial ruin and familial betrayal. I was walking out completely unburdened. The physical manifestation of my revenge was currently unfolding inside that private dining room, but I did not need to stay and watch the final act. I handed the valet a generous tip, slid into the driver's seat of my car, and drove back to the quiet sanctuary of the suburban home I had successfully protected. The next 3 months moved with the swift, ruthless efficiency of a perfectly optimized global supply chain. I did not shed another tear, and I did not entertain a single moment of doubt. My attorney Donovan preserved the encrypted hard drive and provided the relevant information to federal investigators through the proper legal channels. Investigators then began obtaining and authenticating the original bank records, cloud records, transaction logs, and corporate documents independently. The investigation moved steadily as the records Malik had discovered were independently confirmed through banks, cloud providers, corporate files, and other original sources. The banking institution that held the $50,000 home equity line of credit conducted its own internal review of the Internet Protocol metadata and the geolocation tags. They did not even attempt to fight us in a civil court. Within 4 weeks, I received a formal, heavily stamped letter from the Bank Executive Fraud Department. They officially recognized that my digital signature had been maliciously forged across state lines. The $50,000 debt was completely and permanently expunged from my financial record. The dark, terrifying cloud of foreclosure that had threatened to swallow my son's future was entirely eradicated. My credit score remained absolutely spotless, and my home was legally secure. Jamal did not fare nearly as well in the eyes of the law. The federal authorities did not view his actions as a simple marital dispute or a misguided entrepreneurial mistake. They viewed him as a highly calculating financial predator. 3 days after the spectacular implosion at the steakhouse, federal agents arrived at the luxury downtown penthouse he had been renting with stolen funds. They escorted him out of the glass lobby in handcuffs. Jamal was formally charged with federal offenses, including wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and money laundering, while related theft allegations were handled separately under state law. Because his expensive corporate attorney had immediately withdrawn representation, and because Jamal had absolutely zero legitimate assets to his name, he was forced to rely on an overworked public defender. The judge presiding over his arraignment looked at the overwhelming mountain of digital evidence, noted the massive scale of the offshore embezzlement, and set his bail at a staggering amount that Jamal could not even begin to afford. The man who had worn custom-tailored suits and boasted about his visionary tech startup was now wearing a standard-issue uniform, sitting in a federal holding cell entirely abandoned by the mistress he had sacrificed everything to keep. The months that followed marked the official beginning of a completely new existence for both of us. The heavy, dark cloud of financial anxiety that had hovered over my daily life for over a decade was finally gone. Without Jamal constantly draining my bank accounts to fund his endless delusions, I was finally able to experience the rewarding fruits of my own intense labor. 2 weeks after the bank officially expunged the $50,000 fraudulent debt from my record. I walked into my corporate office and scheduled a direct meeting with the regional vice president. For years, I had purposely held myself back, turning down demanding leadership roles and lucrative travel opportunities, because Jamal insisted his fragile startups needed my constant local support. I told my executives that my availability had permanently changed and that I was fully prepared to step into the senior leadership vacancy we had been discussing for months. They did not hesitate for a single second. I was officially promoted to the position of Vice President of Supply Chain Logistics. The massive promotion came with a substantial salary increase, a generous executive bonus structure, and a beautiful corner office overlooking the bustling downtown district. I threw myself into the new role, utilizing the exact same ruthless logistical precision that had saved my home to restructure our entire corporate distribution network. My professional confidence soared to unprecedented heights. Every single dollar I earned now went directly into secure high-yield investment accounts and aggressive college savings funds for my brilliant son. My credit score remained absolutely spotless, and the beautiful suburban house I had fought so fiercely to protect was officially legally recognized as my sole individual property. I had successfully transformed my home from a site of profound traumatic betrayal into a deeply peaceful, secure sanctuary for our newly rebuilt family of two. The stark, undeniable contrast between my rising professional trajectory and my ex-husband's rapid descent into total ruin was truly staggering to witness. While I was busy directing global logistics operations and building generational wealth for my son Jamal, was busy facing the harsh, unforgiving reality of the federal justice system. I did not personally attend his final sentencing hearing. I had absolutely no desire to look at his face ever again or breathe the same recycled air in a crowded federal courtroom. My attorney Donovan attended the proceedings as a formal observer and called me later that afternoon to provide a detailed, comprehensive report of the conclusion. Donovan told me that Jamal stood before the federal judge completely alone. The massive crowded network of family members and young mistresses that he had once proudly paraded around the city was entirely gone. Jasmine had permanently disappeared into the wind long ago, taking her expensive designer purses and completely erasing him from her digital footprint. His older brother Andre and his sister-in-law Chloe refused to attend the hearing entirely, unwilling to support the man who had systematically robbed their commercial real estate empire. Even his fiercely protective mother, Brenda, was visibly absent, unable to secure reliable transportation from her tiny subsidized apartment to the downtown courthouse. Jamal wore a standard-issue prison uniform, looking visibly aged, terrified, and completely stripped of his arrogant artificial charm. The federal judge showed him absolutely zero leniency. Because of the scale of the financial fraud, the laundering scheme, and the identity theft, Jamal received a substantial federal prison sentence and was remanded to a federal correctional institution. He was also ordered to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in total restitution, a financial penalty he would likely spend the rest of his natural life attempting to satisfy. There were no suspended sentences, and there were absolutely no second chances. I was immediately remanded into federal custody and transported directly to the prison facility where he would spend the next several years of his life, completely isolated from the wealthy, comfortable society he had tried so desperately to manipulate. The swift, brutal justice handed down by the federal court completely finalized the absolute destruction of his toxic, enabling family dynamic. I never heard a single word from Andre or Chloe again. Their marriage remained deeply strained by the profound betrayal and the catastrophic loss of their commercial investments. They were forced to liquidate several of their remaining valuable properties just to cover the massive financial liabilities Jamal had left buried in their joint ledgers. Brenda spent her days sitting in a cramped, noisy apartment, entirely isolated from the wealthy suburban neighbors she used to proudly entertain. She had traded her beautiful, fully paid-off retirement home and her comfortable social standing for the stubborn, blind defense of a greedy predator. Her golden child had rewarded her lifelong loyalty by leaving her completely destitute. I did not feel an ounce of pity for any of them. They had collectively attempted to throw me directly under the bus to save their own reputations. They had sat around that mahogany table in the private dining room, demanding that I absorb a $50,000 debt just to keep a young mistress comfortable. They had reaped the exact bitter harvest they had so arrogantly planted, and I was completely free of their deeply exhausting drama. I officially blocked their phone numbers, changed all of my personal contact information, and erased their toxic existence from my daily reality. There was absolutely no lingering conflict left to resolve. The villains of my story had faced their ultimate undeniable consequences, and I was finally able to close that dark, painful chapter of my life forever. I poured all of my renewed physical and emotional energy directly into the only two things that truly mattered in this world: my own thriving professional career and the bright, limitless future of my son Malik. My marriage ended far more quietly than Jamal's criminal case. Once the bank formally recognized the home equity loan as fraudulent, and investigators began authenticating the financial records, his leverage in the divorce disappeared almost completely. I filed for divorce and allowed my legal team to handle every communication, so Jamal could no longer use our marriage as another opportunity to manipulate me. There was no dramatic reconciliation and no final attempt to save what he had destroyed. Through counsel, Jamal eventually agreed to an uncontested settlement. He waived any claim against my retirement accounts, and the house remained my primary residence with Malik. The restitution he owed his other victims and the criminal proceedings against him remained completely separate from our divorce. The family court confirmed me as Malik's primary legal and physical custodian. Any future contact between Jamal and our son would be governed by the court and by Malik's welfare rather than by Jamal's demands. I never asked Malik to hate his father, and I never made him responsible for what Jamal had done. My responsibility was simply to give my son the stability his father had tried to steal from him. When the final divorce order arrived, I read it once, signed the acknowledgement, and placed it inside a filing cabinet. 13 years of marriage ended without fireworks. Emotionally, the marriage had already ended. The afternoon Jamal threw $50,000 of forged debt onto my kitchen island and told me to figure it out. Now it was over legally too. Malik continued to excel in ways that constantly amazed and inspired me every single day. Without the heavy, oppressive weight of his father, constant, arrogant demands, and highly erratic behavior filling our house, Malik truly blossomed into a confident, deeply grounded young man. The advanced coding skills he had initially used to expose his father's massive offshore embezzlement scheme were now being channeled into positive, productive outlets. I enrolled him in a highly prestigious advanced technology and cybersecurity program for gifted students. He spent his weekends designing complex, secure software systems and building robust digital architecture that completely baffled his own instructors. He was no longer the quiet, anxious child, carrying the heavy, terrifying burden of a broken family. I was a deeply brilliant, fiercely protected young scholar who knew with absolute certainty that his mother would move heaven and earth to keep him safe. We spent our evenings cooking healthy meals together, laughing brightly in our beautiful kitchen, and openly discussing his ambitious plans for college and beyond. The profound trauma of the betrayal had not broken our spirits or hardened our hearts. It had simply forged an unbreakable, powerful bond of mutual respect and deep, unconditional love between us. Exactly 1 year after the day, Jamal packed his designer duffel bag and arrogantly walked out of my life. I sat quietly on the comfortable back patio of my beautiful, secure home. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow across the perfectly manicured green lawn. I took a slow, deep sip of my hot black coffee, completely savoring the profound silence of my peaceful suburban sanctuary. The heavy glass sliding door clicked open behind me, and Malik walked out onto the wooden deck. He had grown several inches taller over the past year, his posture straight and proudly confident. He was holding his sleek, refurbished laptop in his hands, the very same device that had served as the ultimate weapon of truth in our darkest, most terrifying hour. He turned the bright screen around to face me, a proud, quiet smile spreading across his handsome young face. Displayed proudly on the monitor was an official acceptance letter to a highly exclusive National Coding Academy, along with a flawless perfect score on his final entrance examination. I smiled back at my brilliant son setting my coffee mug down on the patio table. We shared a long, knowing, quiet look that communicated volumes without requiring a single spoken word. In that beautiful, perfect moment, the ultimate realization washed over my entire being. I had finally learned a very important lesson that true, undeniable power is never about screaming the loudest in a crowded room. True power is not ever about engaging in petty arguments or desperately begging people to see your inherent value. True power is about quietly, deeply knowing your own worth and fully embracing your boundaries. It is about fiercely protecting your personal peace and hard-earned stability at all costs. And most importantly, true power is about always having the undeniable concrete receipts to ruthlessly back it all up when the specific people you trusted most foolishly attempt to betray and completely destroy you. The lesson from Maya's story is simple. Never ignore your worth, just to keep someone else comfortable. Trust should never require you to sacrifice your financial security, dignity, or future. Maya survived because she stopped protecting someone who had repeatedly betrayed her and started protecting herself and her son instead. She also learned that calm preparation can be more powerful than anger. Evidence, patience, boundaries, and courage allowed the truth to speak for itself. Sometimes the strongest revenge is not destroying the people who hurt you. It is refusing to let their choices control your life any longer. If this story inspired you, like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.